Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glendivid Books. Is the accidental firing of a supersonic missile from one nuclear weapon state to another a cause of serious concern? And has it got the attention it deserves? Those are the two key issues I shall explore today with the director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation, Dr. Rajagopalan. Dr. Rajagopalan, let me start with a simple question. Is the accidental firing of a supersonic missile by one nuclear weapon state at another, who is also a rival and a neighbor, a matter of serious concern? Or, as some voices in India are suggesting, it's not such a big deal because it was unarmed and there were no casualties?
Thank you, Mr. Thapar, for having me on this program. No, I think the issue that you raised is a serious matter, and I wouldn't agree that it is a minor issue. Even if it was an overflight, for instance, by an aircraft, by accident, lose their way, for instance, or something of that kind, it is still serious, and we have agreements for that. We don't fly our planes close to the border. I think there's a 10-kilometer near the border sort of a limitation in a sense. We don't test our missiles closer to the border areas. Indian missiles, for instance, are done to the east. Pakistan does far away from the Indian borders. And even during the Cold War, the US and the Soviets, for instance, took a lot of different precautions to not put their targeting radars on to target each other when they met at sea, for instance, as per the Incidents and Sea Agreement. So there are a lot of protocols and agreements that have been put into place precisely to avoid any kind of danger that comes from accidents or inadvertent weapons use and things like that. So this is a serious matter. While these may be to do with conventional systems, missiles are even more serious. The fact that it was not armed or that it didn't cause any harm on the ground, we are glad that was the case. But imagine if it had killed a Pakistani civilian, or even someone from the forces, we would have been in bigger trouble. We were lucky that didn't happen in a sense. But so I would say that this is something very serious, and serious inquiry needs to happen as to why it happened in the first place.
In which case, let me ask you, are we lucky that Pakistan realized that the missile had been fired in error and did not take immediate self-defense countermeasures?
So we still don't know a lot of things about this particular accident or incident. It is less than a week since the incident occurred. So there is very little information to go by. And because of that, we also don't know, for instance, if Pakistan detected the missile in the first place. Also, the India-Pakistan case is always full of controversies, mysteries, backstories. So we may never have the full information even after maybe a year or so. But the key thing is that Pakistan detected whether it did detect the missile or not before it landed on its territory. The assumption here is that they did not respond even after they detected, but we don't know that particular aspect for sure. If they saw the missile, the normal reaction would have been to increase this, for instance, their alert status. But you didn't see that kind of a response from the Pakistani side. So their non-response is because maybe they didn't say anything at all. And when they did realize it was an Indian missile, they could have still put the forces on alert. But I think within the first 24 hours when it happened, for instance, once Pakistan realized that it was a missile, we were lucky certainly that they did not respond, because further complication is that India claims that we immediately informed them. Again, we don't know what is it immediate means, and we don't know how quickly it was it done, whether it was within minutes of us realizing that it had sort of it had gone veered away from their flight path, or which was it?
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
Where have you picked up that India immediately informed Pakistan? That hasn't been said by the government. It hasn't been said by the Ministry of Defense. And Pakistan's National Security Advisor, Mohid Yusuf, has gone on record to say that India did not inform Pakistan. Secondly, he says it's only 24 hours after Pakistan went public that India admitted something happened. And certainly, the Ministry of Defense's statement was 48 hours after the event. The event happened on Wednesday, the 9th. The statement was on the evening of Friday, the 11th. So where did you pick up this line that India immediately informed Pakistan?
So it's purely based on media reports who are citing official sources. So clearly the acknowledgement, the Indian statement came 48 hours later. But possibly, or what the senior Indian officials are possibly saying is that they had informed the Pakistani authorities immediately.
Forgive me, I'm
Even
interrupting
before the
again
Pakistani
because I've
statement.
been reading the media in India extensively, and what the media has said is that the DGMO hotlines were not activated, which could have been. I haven't read a single Indian media source that claims India informed Pakistan immediately. This
So
is what I'm
again, the
asking.
immediately, yeah. So the immediately, that bit is a very confusing thing. Like I said, you don't know whether it was within minutes that they informed or within hours that they informed. But certainly before the Pakistani statement, NSA statement came out, apparently they had informed.
But
The
this is
Indian
again, I'm asking
statement
you,
opened.
on what basis are you saying that? Because it hasn't been reported in the Indian press, and the Indian government hasn't told us either. So I'm simply
No, I
asking,
think
where
there
have
were.
you heard this?
No, I think there was an Indian state. One of the Indian media reports which I read, for instance, I think it was the Wire.
No, forgive me.
Snehesh Phillips
Definitely
report.
not the Wire. Definitely not the Wire.
Okay,
Rahul Bedi in the Wire has an article which explicitly says that India did not
okay,
inform.
okay. But I did certainly come across some reports that talked about some Indian officials saying that they had informed the Pakistani side within immediately. But again, like the key question is, what does immediately mean? Was it within minutes? Was it within hours? Or did they take 24 hours before they came to the
Well,
conclusion
let
that they
me let
needed
me
to
put it like
inform?
this. I'm sure when you say you've read a media source in India claiming India informed Pakistan immediately, you're correct. I'm simply pointing out to
Yes.
the audience that I've read practically all the papers that I could find, and not a single paper claims
Okay.
India informed
Okay.
Pakistan. More importantly, if India had informed Pakistan, the government would have strongly refuted the Pakistan NSA claiming publicly to the world that India only informed Pakistan 24 hours after Pakistan had gone public. India has not refuted that comment at all. And if they had
Okay.
informed
So,
Pakistan, they would have refuted it because they would want it on
sure.
record internationally that the Pakistan NSA is mistaken and wrong.
Okay.
That
Okay.
failure to
So,
refute once again corroborates what I'm saying, that we didn't inform.
okay, so I think there can be variations in terms of how we define that immediate and what is a thing like. But I think even after informing them, it is credit worthy, even at that stage, that Pakistan did not respond. Because I think one has to give credit where it is due, but we don't know if Pakistan, for instance, detected it when it crossed the border, and whether India informed Pakistan before they realized it was a missile. So I think there are these two questions in any case that come into play for sure.
Absolutely. And I'll just, for the sake of the audience, simplify that very important point you made about Pakistan. People in India say that if Pakistan had actually detected the missile, they would have shot it down. The fact that they did not shot, the fact that they did not shoot it down means they didn't detect it. Now, when Pakistan says that in fact they saw it and realized it was in error, they're painting themselves a good picture. But that apart, because they have perhaps a right to paint themselves into a good picture, as you say, it's credit worthy Pakistan did not respond. Let's come to some of the other critical questions that arise from India's response. The statement put out by the Defense Ministry 48 hours later on Friday, the 11th evening says, and I'm quoting, in the course of a routine maintenance, a technical malfunction led to the accidental firing of a missile. And I want to ask you, is that a reassuring statement, or does it end up raising further questions and doubts? After all, one wonders what sort of maintenance is it if it ends up with a missile being fired? That's the first doubt it raises.
No, absolutely. No, those, I think they raise very disturbing questions in a sense. From what I've seen, this was, I think I've seen some reports saying that during maintenance, but I think some of the other reports also have said that this happened during inspection at an IAF base, Indian Air Force base. But either ways, it raises serious questions about India's protocols, practices, and so on and so forth. But not clear about a couple of different things. One is about the India's protocols and systems, or if protocols were there and they were not followed through, which is even a bigger problem. So there are questions then that brings about, for instance, on discipline. and compliance, for instance, within our own establishment. So we could have the best of protocols, agreements in place, and how we should activate various systems if there was an accident or if there is an incident that has happened. But if they are not implemented, if they are not complied with, we have a bigger problem. So, but we don't know at this stage which of this is a problem. If protocols were there themselves were lacking, that's one issue. But if there are protocols that were followed, and even so you had the incident or the accident that have happened, then there is something wrong with the protocols, for instance. If on the other hand, if there were some very good protocols and these were not followed, and if there were violations of the protocols, then that speaks to either poor training or poor discipline within our system. But we, at this stage, we don't know which of these were the problems, but these are all possibilities. But it's actually saying it's quite embarrassing, the kind of systems that we have seen that come into play that has led to this accident, and the kind of response mechanism, the response that we have had so far to this accident.
You're making two very important points. One, you're saying the fact that a routine maintenance could lead to a missile being fired suggests either the protocols that are in place are not good enough and are lacking, or they weren't followed. In either case,
Yes.
as you point out, whether the protocols are insufficient and lacking, or whether they're good but weren't followed, it is embarrassing. And that is the important point. By the way, for the sake of the audience, I'll point out, I was quoting the Defense Ministry statement when I said, and I'm quoting, that in the course of a routine maintenance, a technical malfunction led to the accidental firing of a missile. That is the government's official explanation. And as you said, even the government's explanation is not reassuring. It raises disturbing questions, which frankly should not have been raised. Would it not therefore have been better, Dr. Rajagopalan, for the government to have actually accepted an error had happened, apologize to the Pakistanis for it, but say, we will, after an inquiry, explain how it happened. Instead, the government was late in accepting, 48 hours late. They didn't actually apologize. They only expressed regret, but maybe it's the same thing. And they came up with an explanation. But how can you come up with an explanation when you haven't had an inquiry? And the explanation is the weakest part of the statement. So don't you think they should have accepted, apologized, and said, we will explain when the inquiry is over, rather than produce this sketchy and disturbing explanation?
No, absolutely. We should have accepted that there was this whether it was a technical glitch, whatever happened, that there was an error that happened on our side, which resulted in this accidental firing. First and foremost, I think that should have been accepted without any sort of a further clarification, in a sense. That should have been the first place. And but I think India always tries to come up from a very defensive point. We always try to cover up and kind of think what happened. But I think this is to be, it needs to be reminded that every country goes through some accidents or the other. Maybe not this particular one, but there are, if you look at the broader, even nuclear security incidents, the US, for instance, has the best of the technology, best of policies and regulations. But even there have been several incidents that have happened. So we should have approached this from a point of strength and said, okay, this has happened, and this will be looked into. There will be an inquiry into it, and we will get to the root of it and come up with a further explanation as to what happened and what will be done. What are the steps being taken? I think that's even more important in that sense.
Well, in fact, I'll come to the steps being taken in a moment's time, because the government hasn't spoken very much about them, beyond saying they're instituting a court of inquiry. But before I come to that, I want to pick up on what you said in the middle of that answer. You say, and I wrote it down, we always try to cover up, and that is a mistake. In that spirit, I want to ask you a few critical questions, because I think those questions are fundamentally to do with the accidental firing of a supersonic missile. First of all, was the self-destruct mechanism activated? If it was, did it fail? Or did we fail to activate it? Or is there no self-destruct mechanism on this missile? Aren't those questions that need to be answered? Aren't they legitimate questions to ask?
Absolutely. To take your last question first, I think these are extremely important questions, very legitimate questions to ask. And from what we hear through journalists who were briefed by senior officials, these were practice rounds, and any practice or training rounds would certainly have a self-destruct mechanism. And certainly any reasonably long-range missile would have had the self-destruct mechanism. So it's impossible to believe that it did not have. Any of these missiles, when they were taken for practice, when they are taken for practice or training, they certainly would have had the self-destruct mechanism in place. But we don't know why these were not activated. I really don't have a good answer for that. Were they waiting for orders from some higher authorities to activate the self-destruct mechanism? Or did they activate the self-destruct mechanism and did it fail? That's other question. Or whoever was using the missile did not know how to activate it. Again, these are all possibilities that we are looking at. Also, there are issues like by the time they realized the missile was veering away, was it already out of range to engage the self-destruct mechanism? A lot of missiles have this particular feature where you cannot activate it once it is out of range. So I don't think I have a clear answer to your question, but they are important questions to raise. And I realize that I'm responding with a lot many more questions to your questions. And that's precisely because we don't have a lot of information at this stage.
Absolutely. But responding with questions to my questions is very understandable, but I'll point out for the audience that two of the questions that you raised as possibilities are deeply worrying. One that's deeply worrying is that they didn't get clearance to deactivate, to press, forgive me, the self-destruct button and activate it. If they didn't get clearance, it means there's a problem in the protocols because that clearance has to be available very quickly. Time is of the essence. And if protocols delay your getting it, that means there's another problem with the protocol because there was a delay in getting permission. The other problem you raised is maybe the person concerned didn't know how to activate the self-destruct. That's even worse. Yeah. That you have people in charge of missiles and it goes wrong and they don't know how to activate the self-destruct. Both of those possibilities are deeply worrying. But you've also said that it's impossible to believe there wasn't a self-destruct.
Yeah.
So all the possibilities that then flow actually are very worrying. Again, aren't these issues the government must clarify very quickly? Because presumably these answers they already have.
Absolutely, but I think they might be just playing by caution, being cautious about the whole thing. So they would want to do an inquiry into what happened and then come out with clearer answers rather than shooting off at this point of time. And also, I think there are questions like what kind of information can we put out in the open? They may be, especially India being extremely secretive, sensitive to information being available in the public. So I can kind of imagine why the Ministry of Defense is kind of being cagey about it or not really talking about it. But I think we still need some answers to what happened in a sense.
Let me ask you another set of questions. Do we need to be officially told by the government what sort of missile there was? Journalists have come to the conclusion it was a BrahMos cruise missile, but this hasn't been confirmed by the government. Shouldn't the government confirm it? And secondly, shouldn't the government also tell the country and the world what was the intended flight path? Because again, that hasn't been explained. And although it may be too late to speak authoritatively, shouldn't the government also give some sense of why this missile veered away from the flight path? Again, these are three things that would reassure people that we're on top of it and we're behaving responsibly. Silence only raises doubts about whether we're on top of the situation, whether we're being responsible.
No, actually, absolutely. It would be nice to be told, but again, going by my own experience in dealing with nuclear security issues and kind of thing, it does not give me a lot of confidence that all of this information that we seek are going to be. So I'm not entirely sure that we would be told about the incidents in such details. The inquiry, for instance, most likely will look at only the actual firing, how it got fired, why no self-destruct mechanism was activated. I don't think they will go so much into what kind of missile was being used was being used at this point of time. But there is, like I said, enough information to somewhat suggest that it was a BrahMos missile. Again, going by media reports, not that the government has clarified or confirmed that it was a BrahMos cruise missile that was used. But details like intended flight path, I'm not entirely sure that it should be out in the open. That's not necessary in some sense. Because releasing information like intended flight path but potentially give Pakistan details about gaps in their air defense coverage, for instance. Because if India intends to use and exploit these gaps in the future, giving away such information in the open works against our interests, because that would essentially help Pakistan to strengthen their air coverage, air defense coverage, or the radar coverage, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we are interested in Pakistan wanting to strengthening its own air defense coverage. Or even if they're not, about the gaps in Pakistan's air defense coverage, for instance, putting such information in the open is not a smart thing, because it's essentially telling Pakistan that these are the flight paths that our missiles will take. And so they can sort of increasingly easily strengthen or increase their defenses along the entire flight paths.
I take your point entirely about how it would be unwise to release details of the intended flight path. And that also means it would be unwise to explain why this missile veered off the path. However, given that this has raised international concerns about India's behavior as a responsible nuclear power, should we at least make available, almost in a day or so, answers to questions like, did this have a self-destruct mechanism? Was it activated? Did it fail to work? Or were there problems in activating it because the protocols required permissions which weren't available? Or that the person who was in a position to activate it didn't know how to do so? Should at least those be answered? Because there are international concerns and you need to allay them quickly, and time is not on your side.
Absolutely. No, some of the basic information, whether these contained, this missile contained this self-destruct mechanism, whether it was activated, I think that needs to be out there. But I think you raised another question earlier as to why the missile veered away from its intended flight path. And we still, again, don't know whether if it veered away from its flight path. From what we see, again, based on senior officials' briefing on the incident, it followed a predetermined flight path and a predetermined target. But certain factors, and this is the most confusing bit on the from the officials' description or briefing, certain factors prevented it from hitting the target. To me, that's the most confusing bit, because if the flight path and target were predetermined, why did it not hit the target? I think it just leaves me a lot more back. So the whole explanation does not make sense to me from the senior officials meeting. What are these certain factors that came into play? Again, that needs to be known as to what prevented it from hitting the target. Once fired, because these missiles you don't have control over these things like drones, for instance, you can still control. But a cruise missile, you don't have that control. Once you have fired, you don't have a control. So one possible answer is that there was no predetermined flight path or predetermined target, and it simply took a random route and it landed when it ran out of fuel, for instance. But again, these are all possible assumptions we are making in the absence of credible information provided by the government.
Absolutely. The other explanation, and as you're pointing out, in the absence of that information, speculation will be rife, and speculation not just in India but abroad, and none of that is helpful to our image.
Yeah. There is also another possible explanation which we must take into consideration, because possibly there was a predetermined flight path and a target that were meant from a different location, for instance, maybe from the southern India or somewhere else in the country. And you had the directions and instructions for the flight path for a different target. But because the missile was fired from a certain different location, for a certain different origin point, there was no target possibly. And it landed where it landed because it ran out of fuel. So again, like you said, because the government has not provided any credible information, we are all speculating, we are all making possible explanation, coming up with explanation on what could have happened and what might kind of happen.
Do you know, Dr. Rajagopalan, the speculative scenarios that you sketched out are either failure, we followed a predetermined path but failed to hit the target, that's failure, or the predetermined path was set for a different location, but the missile was in another location. That seems to suggest incompetence. None of these are terribly reassuring either to Indians or to the world.
Absolutely. No, this again takes me back to an earlier point that I made about the poor training that happens in our institution. This shows incompetence and possibly poor training, if a lack of effective compliance with the protocols, if they exist, if there are good protocols, and if you're not able to comply with it, and exactly the implementation is the key. And if you're and I think this is where you need to have a lot of simulation exercises and so on and so forth to test out various parameters, various things as to how they will come into play. Should there be an incident of this kind, what are your different steps that come into play? And then you will be able to test out, for instance, if your chain of command, for instance, how effective it is, for instance.
Okay.
If you're waiting for a go ahead from your senior officials from the ministry, is that being an effective mechanism that you're dealing with in a live situation as it happened now? So I think these are situations that India must simulate so that we can address some of the loopholes that exist in our system.
Absolutely. As you say, a whole bag full, maybe I should use the phrase, of Pandora's box of concerns have popped out. And as I said earlier, they range from poor training, which is perhaps the best of the worst explanations, through to incompetence and failure. And all of these have to be addressed. What the government has done is to announce the appointment of a high-level court of inquiry. But given that a court of inquiry appointed in 2019, when the Air Force accidentally shot down an army helicopter, killing some 6 or 7 people, that court of inquiry took 6 months to submit its findings. So in this instance, when the issue concerns not just Pakistan, but actually it's of great interest and concern to the whole world, because the world wants assurances that we are a responsible nuclear power. Is this court of inquiry a sufficient and effective response?
Yeah, I can only be hopeful that this inquiry will not take 6 months as it did in the past, and come out with its findings in a reasonable time frame. But it also needs to be thorough. And hopefully it will give sufficient information in the report as to what happened, what actions might be taken to prevent such occurrences in the future. But again, we are looking at, I think the defense minister is to make a statement in the parliament at 12 noon. But as of now, we still don't have any information. Maybe the defense minister's statement will spell out more details and give some sort of a clarification. But again, that's all in the future. We still don't know how we are going to respond to this. But certainly, Indian community has to know, Indian strategy community, as well as the larger population, needs to be confident that the government is handling this very well. But the international aspect is very, very critical. As such, there have been enough number of players in the Western context, especially, who have remained concerned about India's nuclear security practices, not because we don't have good nuclear security policies and practices, but we don't talk about them. So absence of us talking about nuclear security has always meant critical of being India, saying that maybe India does not have a policy at all. And that's far from reality. So we need to talk about it. Or outreach and communication have always been India's in a sense, the weak points. And this is something that India has to address, especially at this point of time when you have an accidental firing of a cruise missile or like BrahMos.
Let me ask you a specific question. What impact will this accidental firing of a supersonic missile, as well as the government's initial response, and I include in that the government's failure to inform Pakistan, because the government hasn't refuted the NSA's claim. What impact will all of this have on India's image and standing as a responsible nuclear power?
Certainly, it doesn't help at all. It doesn't help make a strong case that India is a strong, credible, responsible nuclear state and nuclear power. But I think that's where I said one thing, this is just one thing, that responsible power is not just about one thing. So this is seriously could damage in terms of how we are able to respond. And again, that there has been some sort of a failure. But I think being a responsible nuclear power, it goes beyond, and it's well beyond this. And it's about being a well-rounded view that has to do with India's energy NFU policy, the no first use policy, ensuring that its nuclear technology does not get leaked to other countries and parties, unlike AQ in our neighborhood or China, for instance, giving nuclear technology, nuclear know-how to other countries. But at the same time, I'm not trying to justify what India has done, because India's image from this whole incident is going to be damaging unless India takes corrective and effective measures. So it will depend on how India is able to handle. Every country, like I said, makes mistakes, but it depends on how you handle this particular issue. And at least in the first bit, we have not done very well. So as much as it is a problem, I can also say that it's an opportunity to show to the world and to strengthen your own credentials by strengthening your regulations, strengthening your protocols, strengthening your implementation mechanism in a sense.
So I'm going to repeat what you said. I'm going to repeat what you said. India's standing internationally will depend upon how India handles this issue. And then very importantly, you said, in the first instance, we have not done very well. In that light, in the light of that comment that you made, I want to quote to you what Pakistan's NSA has told the world. He says, this incident indicates many loopholes and technical lapses of a serious nature in Indian handling of strategic weapons. How should we respond to that? Because many in the world might agree with him. After all, I'm quoting Frank O'Donnell, the Deputy Director of the Stimson Center. He's the South Asia Program Deputy Director. He's gone on record to say there are very few cases in history, if any, he adds, of a nuclear-armed rival accidentally firing a missile into the territory of another nuclear-armed rival. If that happens, as is the case, then the argument being made by the Pakistan NSA could be bought into by many other countries. So how should we respond to this? How do we assure them that we don't have loopholes, we don't have technical lapses?
So clearly, Pakistan is not going to leave this opportune moment to highlight that India is a weak state when it comes to...
And why should they? Why should they? We've given them some opportunity.
Absolutely.
Why should they?
Exactly. We have provided an ample of an effective opportunity for them to kind of make effective use of it. But like I said, all countries make mistakes. And I go back to the point in that there have been several close calls even during the Cold War. But so countries do mistakes. But I think India should have come from a point of strength and admitted, like you said in the beginning, that there has been an error and this will be looked into. And these are the things that have happened. And these appear to be the things that have happened in the initial scan of things. This is how it transpired. But instead of that, India tried to cover up or become defensive about it. But hopefully now we can take the next step of saying that, okay, fine, conduct a thorough inquiry and taking action to ensure that this doesn't happen. I think it's effectively is also very important. There has to be some information on what action has been taken. It's not good enough for the government to say that there have been various steps being taken, but some information has to be shared with the larger global nuclear community on what action has been taken that can demonstrate that India is a responsible state. We will also need to reassure our friends and partners about what has happened. Again, I'm sure there are different channels of communication. Everything need not be in the public domain, but I think the Indian government has to get on to an effective and speedy outreach program where it talks to all of its major partners and conveys as to what happened in the first place, how it happened, what action has been taken, what are the various measures that have been taken, for instance, the protocols and the various practices have been changed in the light of this particular accident. I think these are important measures that India has to take if it has to regain, because some amount of damage has happened for sure. And I think that if India has to be able to effectively regain its reputation as a responsible nuclear power, it has to engage in extensive outreach at the earliest.
You're making a very important case and point there. You're saying simply issuing a statement that action has been taken is not enough.
No.
We need to spell out what that action is. Some of it can be spelled out in public, but what cannot be spelled out in public must be shared with our partners and our allies and our friends. And there we must tell them fairly honestly what happened, how it happened, what action was taken, what protocols are being revised and looked at again. And only when that balance is achieved, of the balance being between what you can say in public and what you give in greater detail in private to governments to reassure them, only when that happens will we regain our damaged image as a responsible superpower.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Absolutely, you are right. In a sense, India has to use this as an opportune moment to talk to our partners, because I think when it comes to security, India is always shy of talking to its own partners. Nuclear safety issues, we talk to a lot of different countries, including the US, including countries like France, who has remained one of India's closest strategic partners. Or space security. Security, we are extremely allergic to when talking to partners. Safety issues, we are open to talking to them. But I think this is an opportune moment. This is a moment that has come to India to rebuild some of this nuclear security credentials, in a sense, by engaging extensive outreach so that you can reassure the partners, because these are countries who have helped you when you needed an NSG exemption in 2016.
Absolutely.
2008 for not 2000.
That NSG exemption was only given because the world believed we were a responsible nuclear power. If we mishandle the accident, if we do not share information, if we are reluctant to accept an error was made and point out how, then that standing that we have as a major responsible nuclear power will be damaged. In other words, to put it in a nutshell, and this is my last question, the world wants a credible assurance there won't be a repeat of this ever again. And simply saying there won't be a repeat is not enough. You have to convince them by the steps you've taken, right?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So India has to engage in extensive outreach if it has to. There has been, like I said, a certain amount of damage that has been done. The image of being a responsible nuclear power has been dented, and that has to be addressed by India pointedly in a direct manner. And everything may not be done through open channels of communication. Openly, publicly available information may be limited, but India can and must use other channels of communication. Maybe at the IAEA, you can have a meeting among your own partners and friends and strategic allies, in a sense, or other forums. There are nuclear security summit partners you have. Engage them extensively so that you can remove some of the apprehensions that may have come about on India being a responsible nuclear power, in a sense.
Dr. Rajagopalan, thank you very much for this interview. I'm very grateful to you for having been willing to speak so comprehensively on a subject that most people shy away from because they believe on national security silence is best. Actually, if you want to establish credibility, you need to be able to communicate convincingly, because then only do you keep trust. I thank you very much for this interview. Take care.
Absolutely. The weakness has been the absence of communication. And I think this is one area that India must spend a lot of time and effort in talking to others. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.